My husband's mother showed up at the hospital 2 hours after I had a miscarriage. She didn't bring flowers, she brought a folder. I remember staring at the ceiling of that recovery room in St. Michael's Hospital, the kind of staring you do when your body is still there, but your mind has gone somewhere quieter, somewhere it doesn't have to feel anything yet. The nurse had just changed my IV. The room smelled like antiseptic and the faint ghost of someone else's lunch. And then I heard heels clicking down the hallway, that particular rhythm I had learned to dread over 4 years of marriage. And I knew before the door even opened that whatever came next would not be about me. My mother-in-law sat down without being invited. She opened the folder on her lap and said we needed to talk about the cottage. My grandmother had left me a property on Lake Huron when she passed the previous spring. A small cedar cottage that had been in our family for 30 years. Nothing fancy. The porch screens needed replacing. The dock was old. The water pressure from the well had never been reliable. But it was the place where I had spent every summer of my childhood. The place where my grandmother taught me to paddle a canoe. Where I learned to read the weather coming in off the water. Where she used to make tea in the mornings and sit with me at the kitchen table and ask what I was thinking about, and actually wait for the answer. She had left it to me specifically. Not to my mother, not to my aunt, not to anyone else, just to me. I had cried at the reading of the will because it felt like one last message from her, one last act of someone who had always seen me clearly. My mother-in-law had opinions about the property. She had been sharing those opinions for months, and now, 2 hours after I had lost a pregnancy, she was sharing them again. I told her I was tired and asked her to leave. She said she understood this was difficult, but that timing mattered when it came to real estate decisions. She said my husband agreed with her, and then she set a document on the edge of my bed, something pre-signed, something she expected me to add my name to, and she folded her hands and waited. I did not sign it. I turned my face toward the window and stared at the parking lot below until she eventually stood up and clicked her heels back down the hallway. But my husband didn't come that night. He called. He said he was sorry about the baby. He said his mother had good intentions. He said we would talk when I came home. His voice had that particular flatness it got whenever he was telling me the version of things he had decided I should hear. And I lay in that hospital bed in the dark thinking about how long I had been confusing that flatness with calm. I had met my husband at a work event in downtown Toronto 7 years earlier. He was confident in the way that certain men are confident when they've never had a reason not to be. Easy with crowds, quick with a smile, comfortable at the center of a room. I had found it attractive at first. I'd spent most of my 20s quietly, a bit too careful, and there was something that felt freeing about being with someone who moved through the world without hesitation. His family had money. Not loud money, but old money, the kind that accumulates across generations and eventually becomes simply the way things are. His mother managed the family finances after his father's death. She was precise, organized, and unapologetic about prioritizing the family's interests above everything else, including me. My own family was different. My mother and I had grown close when I was in my late teens, after my parents separated. She worked as a school administrator in Kitchener. She was kind but stretched thin, and she had always taken my husband's side in arguments. Not because she didn't love me, but because she wanted to keep the peace, because she was conflict avoidant in a way that cost her more than she realized. My aunt, her younger sister, lived up near Sudbury and called every few weeks, but hadn't been close to our grandmother the way I had. And then there was Uncle Ray, my grandmother's brother, 12 years younger than she was, which made him 73 now. He lived alone on a small property outside Owen Sound, kept a vegetable garden, drove an old pickup truck, and had been largely absent from family events for the past decade. My mother used to say he was difficult. My aunt agreed. My husband, the one time he'd met Uncle Ray at my grandmother's funeral, had described him as eccentric. I had my own memories of him. Summer afternoons at the cottage when I was small. Uncle Ray sitting on the dock teaching me the names of the birds that came through. He wasn't effusive with affection, but his attention was steady and specific. He remembered what you told him. He asked good questions, and he had loved my grandmother completely. After the funeral, the family had drifted in separate directions, and I had let the connection with him thin out the way you do when life fills up with other things. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years. I came home from the hospital on a Thursday. My husband picked me up, carried my bag inside, made tea, and sat across from me at the kitchen table in our condo in Oakville, with the careful posture of someone who has rehearsed what they are about to say. He told me the cottage was a liability. He said the property taxes had increased, that the structure would need significant repairs over the next few years, and that holding onto it was sentimental rather than practical. He said his mother had connected with a buyer who was offering a fair price, and that the offer had a limited window. I asked him why he had agreed to any of this without talking to me first. He said he was trying to handle things so I didn't have to. I sat with that sentence for a long time after he went to bed. Trying to handle things, as if I were a problem that needed management. As if my grandmother's cottage were a line item on a balance sheet, rather than the only place I had ever felt completely like myself. I didn't sleep. I made another cup of tea and sat at the kitchen window watching the orange glow of the street below. And somewhere in the early hours of the morning, I started going back through our joint finances. I had access to the accounts but had let my husband manage most of it for the past few years. He was better with numbers, or so I had always told myself. What I found over the next few hours confused me at first. There were transfers I didn't recognize, amounts that moved between accounts on dates that didn't correspond to any bill or purchase I could identify. Some were small, some were not, and several of them led to an account I had never seen before, attached to a numbered company I had no knowledge of. I closed the laptop. I stared at the table. I thought about the folder my mother-in-law had placed on my hospital bed. Then I called my mother. She answered on the second ring, even though it was past midnight, and when I started talking she listened without interrupting, which was not something she usually did. I told her about the transfers, about the folder, about the conversation with my husband. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then, she said something that surprised me. She said, "Sweetheart, I think you need to call Ray." She explained, carefully, that he had tried to talk to her the previous year about concerns he'd had after our grandmother's estate was settled. She had dismissed him. She had assumed he was being difficult, the way she always assumed he was being difficult, because it was easier than taking him seriously. But some of what I had just described matched things he had said to her, things she hadn't wanted to hear. I sat with the phone pressed against my ear for a moment after she stopped talking. Then I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner. She didn't have a good answer. I didn't push. The next morning I called Uncle Ray. He picked up after 3 rings. There was wind in the background, which meant he was probably outside already, probably in the garden. When I said it was me, there was a pause that was hard to read, and then he said, "I wondered when you'd call." He drove down 2 days later. He arrived at my door in the old pickup with a bag of produce from his garden, and a cardboard box that he set on my kitchen table without explanation. Inside were folders, printed documents, photocopies, a small USB drive. He sat across from me and said he was going to tell me some things that were difficult to hear, and he asked me to let him finish before I responded. Over the next 2 hours, he laid out what he had found. After our grandmother died, he had spent time going through her personal papers, which she had left him access to. He had noticed inconsistencies in how the estate had been documented. Certain assets that she had discussed with him during her lifetime didn't appear in the final accounting. A piece of land adjacent to the cottage property had been transferred out of her name approximately 8 months before she died, through a process that Uncle Ray had found difficult to trace, and which hadn't been mentioned in the will or the estate summary. He had raised this with the family lawyer at the time. He had been told there was no irregularity. He had raised it with my mother. She had told him to let it go. He had contacted a second lawyer independently and been advised that he could pursue it, but that it would take time and resources, and then he had found something else. A numbered company connected to a series of transactions involving property on the Lake Huron shoreline. Transactions that had begun while our grandmother was still alive and had continued after her death. One of the names associated with that company, appearing in incorporation documents he had obtained through a provincial registry search, was my husband's. I didn't say anything for a while. Uncle Ray poured us each a glass of water from the tap and waited. The piece of land adjacent to the cottage was worth considerably more than the cottage itself. There had been interest from a developer in that area for the past several years. If the cottage were sold, the buyer would likely seek to purchase the adjacent parcel as well. And the transaction would flow through the numbered company and the profit would not come to me. I thought about the folder on my hospital bed. I thought about the document my mother-in-law had expected me to sign while I was still on an IV drip. I thought about the transfers I had found in the accounts at 2 in the morning. I felt something move through me that was not quite anger and not quite grief. It was something older than either of those things. The particular sensation of understanding, fully and finally, that you have been treated as an obstacle rather than a person. That evening, After Uncle Ray had gone to his motel down the road, I sat with everything he'd left behind. I had a background in financial administration. I'd worked for a non-profit for 6 years and then a small property management company, before taking a step back when my husband's work required us to relocate from Mississauga to Oakville. Those years had given me a foundation that I had rarely applied to my own life. I started applying it now. I worked through the documents methodically, cross-referenced dates, mapped transactions against provincial land registry records I pulled online. By 10 o'clock I had a timeline that was coherent enough to make my hands go still on the keyboard. My husband came home from his work trip to Calgary 2 days later. He walked in, set down his bag, asked how I was feeling. I told him I was okay. He seemed relieved by that. He went to the fridge and got a drink and said he'd been thinking, and he really did believe selling the cottage was the right move. That maybe after everything we'd been through, we needed a clean start. I asked him about the numbered company. The way his face changed told me everything before a single word came out of his mouth. He tried to explain it. The explanation shifted 3 times in under 5 minutes. First, it was an investment vehicle he'd set up to manage some assets. Then it was something his mother had recommended for tax purposes. Then it was something he hadn't been directly involved in, but was familiar with. Each version contradicted the one before it. I didn't interrupt. I let him keep going until the words ran out. When he stopped talking, I told him I had been in contact with a lawyer. I told him I had documentation. I told him I would not be signing anything related to the cottage property or any associated land. He got very still in the way he sometimes did when conversations stopped going the way he'd planned them. Then he said I was making this into something bigger than it was. He said I was emotional from everything that had happened. He said I needed to rest and that we would discuss it properly when I was thinking more clearly. I told him I was thinking more clearly than I had in years. He left to stay at his mother's place that night. I called Uncle Ray. He didn't say I told you so, which I appreciated more than I could say. He said he had the contact information for the second lawyer he'd spoken to, the one he'd approached independently, and that she had indicated willingness to look at the case again if new documentation came forward. He said he'd kept notes of every conversation he'd had about this over the past 1.5 years. It occurred to me then how much effort he had quietly put into this, how long he had been sitting with what he knew while the rest of the family either dismissed him or looked the other way. My grandmother had been his closest sibling. He had watched what happened after she died and had not been able to stop it, but he had documented it, carefully, in the patient way of someone who still believed the truth was worth preserving, even when no one was ready to receive it. I asked him why he had never pushed harder, never made more noise. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Because I needed you to be ready to hear it." In the weeks that followed, things moved quickly in some ways and slowly in others. The lawyer Uncle Ray connected me with was named after a tiny town in northern Ontario. Her parents had a sense of humor, she said, and she was precise and thorough and did not seem to be moved by anything except evidence. We filed for separation. My husband and his mother both contacted me several times through those early weeks, alternating between conciliation and pressure, depending on which approach they thought might work. My mother-in-law sent a letter through her own lawyer suggesting that my claims were baseless and damaging to a family that had welcomed me warmly. I read that letter twice and then filed it with the other documents. My mother drove down from Kitchener more than once that month. She was different than she had been before my hospital call. More present, less measured. She helped me pack boxes in the condo when my husband was traveling and sat on the floor of the bedroom while I went through things and asked me what I needed, rather than telling me what to do. One evening she started crying without warning. I asked what was wrong, and she said she was sorry she hadn't listened to Ray sooner. I told her I understood. She had grown up in a family that treated peace as a higher value than honesty, and that pattern doesn't break easily, and she was trying now. My aunt drove down from Sudbury one weekend with her partner, and the 4 of us, my mother, my aunt, Uncle Ray, and me, sat around the kitchen table of a rented house I'd moved into near Hamilton and went through everything together. It was the first time in years that the family had gathered without someone managing the narrative, without anyone working to smooth things over or redirect the conversation. It was uncomfortable at times and honest throughout, and I realized that evening that I had never actually seen my family operate this way before. Something had cracked open, and the light getting in was strange but real. The legal process was not clean or quick. Provincial estate disputes rarely are, and the involvement of corporate structures complicated the timeline. There were moments when I felt exhausted to the marrow. Moments when I wondered whether the cottage was worth the toll this was taking. But then I would think about my grandmother sitting at the kitchen table in the mornings, asking what I was thinking about, and waiting for the answer. She had left me that property because she understood what it meant to me. She had seen me clearly, even when others hadn't. And there were people now who had tried to take that away while I was bleeding in a hospital room. I was not going to let that stand. My husband, as more of the financial picture became clear, eventually stopped contesting certain elements of the case. His mother retained her own counsel and the two positions began to diverge, which created new complications but also new clarity. Documents that had been difficult to access became accessible through the discovery process. The numbered company's records showed a pattern that was harder to explain the more complete the picture became. There was an afternoon in early February, a Tuesday, when I was sitting in my new kitchen watching snow come down over the backyard, with a cup of tea and a folder of documents from the previous week's disclosure, and I noticed something I hadn't caught before. A date that matched a conversation I remembered having with my husband 3 years earlier, a conversation where he had referenced a property investment opportunity, and then dropped the subject quickly when I asked follow-up questions. I had forgotten about that conversation entirely. Now it connected to something concrete. I called Uncle Ray that evening. He remembered the same property being mentioned in something he'd found in my grandmother's papers. We compared notes. The connection held. By the time everything was laid out, the missing parcel, the corporate structure, the transfer timing, there was enough to present a clear picture to the relevant parties. Not a dramatic courtroom confrontation, but a structured, documented case that made certain outcomes untenable and forced others into the open. The cottage stayed with me. The adjacent land was a more complicated matter and took longer to resolve, but the claim was ultimately recognized through the estate review process. My husband and I completed our separation in the spring. He did not contest the property settlement in the end. I didn't know whether that was pragmatism or something closer to shame, and I found that I didn't particularly need to know. My relationship with my mother changed that year in ways I hadn't expected. She started asking Uncle Ray to family events again, which was long overdue and slightly awkward at first, and then, gradually, not. They are different people in many ways, but they have the same memory of my grandmother, and that turns out to be enough of a bridge. Uncle Ray's health was not great by the time everything settled. He had a heart condition he hadn't mentioned to anyone, characteristically. He managed it with the same quiet stubbornness with which he managed everything. He still grew vegetables. He still drove the old truck. He still picked up after 3 rings. One afternoon in September, about 18 months after he had appeared at my door with a cardboard box, I drove up to Owen's Sound to spend the weekend. The leaves were turning over the escarpment, that particular October edge gold that you only really see in Ontario. And we walked along the harbor in the evening and he pointed out birds the way he used to when I was small. At dinner, he said he wanted me to know something. He said that my grandmother had talked to him, near the end, about me. Not about the cottage, not about the will, but about me as a person. She had told him she worried about how much I accommodated others. How I made myself small to keep things smooth. She had hoped that would change. I sat across from him in the small restaurant and looked at the harbor lights on the water. I told him I thought it had changed. He nodded once and picked up his fork, and that was the end of the conversation, which was exactly the right length. The cottage still needs work. The porch screens have been replaced. I did it myself with help from my mother, a Saturday afternoon in June. Neither of us particularly skilled and both of us very determined. The dock was repaired by a local company out of Kincardine. The water pressure from the well remains unreliable. In the mornings when I'm there, I make tea in the kitchen and sit at the table where my grandmother used to sit. The light comes in from the east and lands across the floor in long pale rectangles, and the lake is visible through the window, gray-green and always moving. I think about what she asked me. What are you thinking about? And I find the question still works. I sit there with the tea cooling and the light shifting and I let the answer come. I don't know what shape the next few years will take. I've started working again, part-time for now, with a property management company that was willing to bring me back. I'm in a rented house near Hamilton through the winter, and at the cottage on the weekends when the weather allows. Lily, the old golden retriever I adopted 6 months ago, the one who didn't care about any of the backstory, and just needed someone to walk her in the mornings, has learned to love the dock. What I know is that the ground I'm standing on is mine, that the decisions ahead of me are mine to make. That the people in my life now are people who have seen me clearly and told me the truth even when it was difficult, and that turns out to be the only kind of relationship worth building anything on. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love knowing who's out there, and if this story stayed with you, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next.